today to listen to your work. We will present your work to the committee, who is composed of, I will tell you in a minute, of Professor Francesco Mattelotta, who is the Professor of Acoustics and Architectural Engineering at the Politecnico di Bari in Italy. We will have, he is online, we will have Sten Strom, who is Professor at the Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden, in Stockholm, and is Professor of Music Acoustics. We will have also online Jude Brereton, Professor of Audio and Music Technologies at the University of York, but now she is not in England, she is far away, if I understood well. We will have Brian Katz, who directed your work, and myself, who is a researcher at the CNRS, at the Science and Technology of Music and Sound at Organum in Paris. We will first listen to you for about 45 minutes, and then we will ask you questions in the order that has been decided according to the distance with the current police. And then we will have your deliberation, and we will call you back to value the result.
Great.
So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
5 minutes.
Yes, hopefully 45. Well, hello everyone, and good afternoon from Paris for those who are joining us remotely. I'm really honored by your participation in my doctoral defense today, and I'm looking forward to the conversations that we're all going to have at the end of this presentation. So without further ado, let's jump right into this. My name, as you probably know already, is Sarabeth MULLINS, and I'm presenting today on a dissertation entitled De voix du passé, the historical acoustics of Notre-Dame de Paris and choral polyphony. So a little context about this particular research project. It takes place in the context of the fire that happened at the cathedral in 2019. So after this fire, there was a renewed interest in the scientific, the materials, the construction, the cultural legacy of the cathedral. And in order to support the reconstruction efforts, a scientific committee was founded to aid in research questions related to matters of the cathedral's history. This is composed of about 50 laboratories, 175 researchers, and it focuses on subject domains related to the materials used in the construction, as well as digital documentation, cultural documentation, and the reason why we're here today, documentation of its acoustic heritage and legacy. So the dissertation was funded by the Acoustics Working Group of the Scientific Committee, as well as an A&R Project Fund and participation from the Sorbonne University. Now, of course, when we use the word reconstruct, that implies that we are going back to something. And we have to ask the question, what is it that we are reconstructing? And this is really more of a question asking, what is Notre Dame's heritage? We could go back and reconstruct the 1400s. We could go back to the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s with its very plush interior, the 1900s. All of these eras are possible for us to focus our reconstruction efforts on, because the fact is Notre-Dame Cathedral has 860 years of history, cultural legacy, and acoustical legacy that we can look at. So in today's presentation, I'm going to be providing a brief overview of the historical, cultural, and scientific contexts at the cathedral. And then we're going to look at the three main parts of my own doctoral research. So first of all, acoustical modeling. And then second, the use of those models to inform singing and listening experiments, looking at the human interaction with the reconstructed acoustics. And then finally, we're going to look at the results of these three different approaches in conversation with each other to see what sorts of insights they might offer to our understanding of the legacy of Notre Dame. So just as a point of brief context, Notre-Dame de Paris is not the first cathedral to be built on Ile de la Cité, about 20 minutes walk from where we are today. In fact, we have archaeological traces of multiple churches that were built on this site since at least the 5th century. The cathedral that we can see today in the present is estimated to be the 3rd cathedral dedicated to Mary on the island. And it began its construction in 1163. Now, construction continued until 1350 when it reached a sort of major architectural stasis where the structure of the building resembles what we see and love today. As you can see in this plan, we have the outline of the modern-day cathedral here, and then here are the traces of 2 sets of large buildings, potentially cathedrals, which were found underneath the foundation and floor of Notre-Dame itself. As far as the musical context goes, the prevailing form of musical genre that was performed at the cathedral throughout its history was a type of music called plain chant. Plain chant is characterized by being a unison melody, so one melody that was sung by multiple people at the same time. And an example of that can be heard here. However, in the period approximately 1150 to 1220, and this is again an approximation by musicologists, the cantors and the priests at the cathedral began to experiment with new styles of music. And in particular, this style that they developed, Notre-Dame polyphony, Notre-Dame organum, is known for the innovation of multiple rhythmic modes, or essentially ways in which you can now create rhythmic patterns by which music can be built upon itself. And these rhythmic modes allow people to compose more technical melodies, allow greater independence between the voices. And the example I'm going to play you now is an example of maybe the most famous piece of music associated with Notre-Dame polyphony. This is called Viderunt Omnes and is attributed to the composer Perrotin. Now, of course, all musical styles come and go. So the School of Notre-Dame was not the last form of music that we've ever heard. As this style became recognized across the cathedrals and the religious groups in Western Europe, more and more musicians encountered it, which meant that more and more musicians had the chance to develop upon the musical ideas that were generated by the original singers at the cathedral. So this final example is a motet that dates to around 1400, so about 150 years after the height of the Notre-Dame school. And we can listen to a few of the innovations they've created. So you can hear in this example that while there are still multiple voices singing at the same time, their melodies and their rhythmic content are now much further separated from each other than they were in the Viderunt Omnes, which is typical of what was being performed at the cathedral. So the reason why this musical context is important is because there's a strange parallel that's going on between the construction of the cathedral and the development of Notre-Dame polyphony. So we can see that around 1163, we switch from the previous Marian cathedral to be built on the island, and we start to see development on Notre-Dame III, the present day, first opening up into the 1182 version of the cathedral, and it progresses in time. Now, parallel to this, in the period of greatest transition from the Basilica-style architecture to the Gothic-style architecture, we see the height of the School of Notre-Dame, and we see the development of the Widder und Omnes, and then later, much later, we see the development of the motet. So if we look at this timeline, we begin to understand why this era is somewhat tantalizing from the question of acoustic heritage. And the final bit of scientific context that I have to provide here is that I'm not the first person to have studied the acoustics of Notre-Dame. In the 20th century and in the 21st century, researchers associated with my lab, including my advisor, have gone and made acoustic measurements of the cathedral. Now, some of these we can't reclaim very well because they were made with older technologies. They were made with balloon pops rather than what we would see today. But we do have documentation of the acoustics before the fire of 2019. And as a part of this research, a calibrated acoustic model of the modern-day cathedral was made, which serves as a sort of digital twin to the physical building. It's created in a stochastic ray tracing software, which allows you to put virtual sources and receivers throughout the cathedral in order to better query certain positions and certain acoustics within it. So having established this background, my thesis is trying to answer three main questions. First of all, did the developments of the Notre-Dame architecture influence the acoustics over the centuries? Secondly, do varying cathedral acoustics influence choral performance and reception of choral performance? And finally, what insights do the answers to the previous two questions give us in terms of answering the larger question about the musical heritage and the acoustical heritage of the cathedral? So let's jump into part one, the acoustical models. For the purposes of this research, I made a series of acoustical models representing specific snapshots of the timeline of the cathedral. So the first one is 1163. This is the church building that predates our modern cathedral. It's built in a basilica style, and it's based on the ruins that were found underneath the cathedral. And then from 1182 and more recently, all of these were based on the acoustical model created by one of my predecessing acoustic researchers, Bart Postma, who has published on it extensively. However, these models were made specifically with reference to archival materials and research conducted by myself and my collaborators in the human sciences to better understand the historical states of the cathedral. So you can see that there's a number of periods represented here. 1182 is the one that represents the earliest point of occupation of the Gothic cathedral. The apse and the choir have been built, and then to separate it from the rest of the cathedral, a large plaster on lath wall was constructed to allow the clergy to go in and practice their daily services while people still continue to work with stone on the other side. By 1220, the nave had been completely enclosed, and almost immediately a new reconstruction campaign began, expanding the sides of the chapels into the space between the foundations of the flying buttresses and creating a row of lateral chapels which were used for private masses and lay people's celebrations. And the final main model that we have to mention here is architecturally the same as the 1350 model, but it is represented in a state of high decoration, as you might expect to see for one of the great feast days of the cathedral, such as Easter, Christmas, Annunciation, something like that. Now, in order to create the 1163 model, the first step was to identify a reference basilica, and working in collaboration with some materials historians, we identified the Basilica of Santa Sabina al Aventino, which is built in Rome. It comes from, I believe, the 3rd century, and it is a 3-aisle basilica that remains largely intact from the way it was initially constructed. And the other reason why it's a particularly good candidate to be a reference for this research is because the acoustics of this building have already been studied and published upon in 2005 by one of our jury members, Francesco, and a collaborator of his. So having found this basilica, an acoustical model was created following the geometry of the building, and it was then calibrated following the acoustic measurements that were reported on previously. And once the behavior of the simulation was falling within one just noticeable difference between the actual measured results and what the simulation was showing, it then became time to move to the next step. So in the next step, the geometry of Santa Sabina is morphed to match the ruins that have been found underneath Notre-Dame, and the final step, to determine a probable height of the entire building, a number of other reference basilicas were selected, and a trend line was set based off of their comparative width to height ratios, and Santa Sabina, now 1163, was set to a height immediately on that trend line. So looking at the results, what we have here are the results of ray tracing simulations with a source inside the liturgical choir of the buildings. And starting in 1163, what you can see with these sound pressure levels is a relatively linear decay over time. Pretty much what you would expect from acoustic behavior inside a large stone box. However, the switch from 1163 to 1182 is very immediate and very apparent. So it is important to note that there are choir stalls, U-shaped choir stalls, in all of the Gothic cathedral models. However, in the 1182 model, the semicircular end of the sanctuary has been left open, and there are no walls there to contain the sound. And what you see there is that between the choir stalls and the actual columns of the cathedral, the sound pressure is being kept inside the most sacred area of the cathedral at a very consistent level in comparison to the areas outside of the cathedral. And this effect is only highlighted and amplified as we continue through time. So even as the cathedral grows around this liturgical choir, we see the acoustics in the choir are remaining relatively constant for people who are observing the Mass, observing the daily ceremonies in there. If we go to an energy ratio, in this case I'm using center time, and just a brief note about center time, this is a little bit like the concept of acoustical clarity, so C50 or C80. But C50 and C80 are both metrics that were determined based on the content that you're listening to. So C80 in this case sort of was developed assuming the content similar to Beethoven, Bruckner, Mahler, very heavy, very complex romantic music with the expectation that you're listening to it as a piece of art. And clarity for speech was also, again, developed as a metric by which you expect to be able to understand what is being said inside that time period. So when you have the case of, for instance, a cathedral where spoken scripture might be declaimed on a melody, and where the melodic singing is not meant to be considered a piece of art in and of itself, I chose to use center time as a content agnostic way of representing the overall ratio of early and late energy within the space. So a low center time, just to orient us, is related to a high level of clarity, which is to say the energy of the early portions of the impulse is going to outweigh the energy in the later portions of the impulse. And similarly, a large center time is going to indicate very poor listening conditions where the reverberant energy is vastly outweighing the direct energy at a certain point. So with that in mind, we can see very similar behaviors as what we saw in the sound pressure levels with these maps of center time. The one thing I would really like to highlight here is the change again from 1163 to 1182, where the area with the lowest center time, which is again inside the liturgical choir, has almost doubled in size from the Constantinian style of building to the Gothic style of building. And furthermore, there's a greater level of consistency in the center time directly surrounding the sanctuary in 1182 than there is for 1163, where we again see a linear increase in, of center time with distance. And if we continue along the various models that have been made here, we can see that by the time we reach 1500, so full architectural completion and full adornment, there are actually multiple locations inside the cathedral which have sort of their own acoustic behavior or their own range of center times. So we have the interior of the sanctuary, we have the apse around it, and then we see a stark delineation in the nave and the side aisles. If we were to look at global levels, so these are multiple sources and receivers averaged over spatial distributions, we can see that the change from the 1163 to the 1182 cathedral introduces a significant decrease in overall reverberation time. 1182 is certainly not a dry cathedral, but in comparison to what came before, it is significantly less soupy of an acoustic as you are walking around in there. The second observation here is when we look at the change from 1182 to 1220, the addition of the transept and the nave dramatically increase the reverberation time outside of the liturgical choir and sanctuary. But as we saw in the previous maps, this change is confined to outside of the areas that priests would have occupied. And finally, if we compare the regular decoration and the highly decorated states, you can again see that for a special occasion, the acoustics of the cathedral would have dramatically changed on the high feasts and holidays. However, outside of the periods of high decoration, you can see that all of these models maintain about the same level of overall reverberation time within about 1 second of each other. So the conclusions we can draw from this are relatively simple. So number one, the change in architectural styles from 1163 to 1182 does create a strongly different acoustical environment, which involves both an increasing clarity and a decreasing reverberation time for people who are using the cathedral as a part of their daily life. These changes, if they were to occur in smaller scale buildings, have been linked to broadly favorable performance conditions for music and for speech intelligibility. These sorts of research questions don't typically come up in the context of very large cathedrals, so we can only point to the smaller ones as a point of parallel. But the change from 1182 and 1220 is only dramatic when you consider it from the perspective of a layperson, so someone who is standing outside the consecrated area of the cathedral. And finally, and to me the most interesting thing, the acoustics of the cathedral are reflecting the same priorities that occupants of the cathedral would have had at this time, where the people inside the club, the people who are allowed to go into the consecrated spaces, are having the best acoustical experience, and the rest of the cathedral has a hierarchical acoustic that follows the uses and expectations. Let's go on to the singing experiments. So we've established that the acoustics of the building have changed over time, but now we have to ask the question, how do these changes actually affect real musicians and real performers? Now, there's been a lot of research into questions of musical communication from the realms of music psychology and cognition, performance analysis, and there's too many models to go into here. So I'm going to broadly summarize some of the points that most of these models tend to agree with. So first of all, performance coordination seems to be multimodal. If I'm trying to sing with another person, we are not only relying on our voices in order to communicate our joint performance, we are also using eye contact, we're using body language. Maybe we've rehearsed before and we've established that if I flick my nose, that's a sign for you to do something or another. So you can't only consider the audio recordings of an ensemble when looking at the ways they are coordinating their joint performance. We've also established that acoustics can influence the musical communication, not just of the sound musicians are producing, but also their visual communication as well, their body language, their micro movements, things like this. And finally, all of the possible modes of communication between performer, co-performer, and potential audience can be influenced by the internal culture of the ensemble. So maybe our ensemble doesn't like to move very much and they only like to sing. Perhaps they're very expressive and there's a lot of movement in those cultures, regardless of the underlying foundation of the ensemble. They can be affected by, or they can affect all of the different ways of communication that we can see. So to get around this question of specific culture, the experiment was designed to use 2 different expert choirs. These choirs are both made up of members who specialize in historically informed performance, and they were asked to prepare 3 different pieces of music, actually the 3 pieces of music that we listened to at the top of this presentation. They also performed in the anechoic chamber in 5 acoustic conditions, so the 4 main ones that I've just introduced you to, and then the anechoic condition as a point of reference for what their performance might have been like if there were no acoustics whatsoever. For each combination of song and acoustic, they were asked to repeat that performance 3 times to make sure we had a clean and usable take. And they were presented with this entire experiment in a set of 4 randomized blocks to ensure that we didn't introduce too much bias into the testing procedures. For these experiments, the hypothesis was that the choirs would perform viderunt omnes with greater synchronicity in the 1182 and 1220 models of Notre-Dame, which are the models that correspond with the height of the School of Notre-Dame's activities. In order to set this up, I had to adapt the calibrations of immersive acoustic environments that have been published for loudspeaker reproduction to be used for binaural headphone reproduction. The choice to use headphones was influenced by a number of factors, most notably COVID and the requirements of how many people you could fit into one room at a time. However, by going to the binaural headphones, that allowed for more specific locations and personalized room acoustics to be provided to each singer in the experiment. So we've got a system diagram of what ended up being the experimental setup here. It was being run on a laptop using Max MSP, doing 16 real-time convolutions and a total system delay of 5.8 milliseconds. And we calibrated the level of the acoustic reproduction to the vocal production in the air by adapting existing measures. So in this case, previous research has used the stage support, late stage support metric, as a way to calibrate loudspeaker-based oralization systems. And we can't quite do that in this setup because you would have to have a source and a receiver 1 meter away from each other inside an oralization room that is where the walls are making up the loudspeaker array. So in order to adapt this, I propose what I'm calling the late system support rather than the late stage support, where rather than calculating off of the same impulse response, we are looking at the ratio of direct sound coming out of the loudspeaker and going into the singer's personal microphone. That is H0 there. And then we are comparing that to the signal of H1, which is the oralization system being rendered over circumoral headphones and being recorded by a binaural dummy head. There's a lot more that went into this. I'm running short on time. If you want to read more about it, you can read about it either in my dissertation or in a previous version of the research which was presented at a conference last year. So moving right ahead, we have our recordings, we have our experiment. How do we quantify synchronicity? Seashore in 1938 proposed 4 ways of thinking about musical performance, dividing it into pitch, timbre, timing, and loudness areas. Now, most of these are broadly applicable regardless of genre. But if we're looking at the synchronicity, if we're looking at how well do the choirs perform together as a whole, the 2 ones that immediately pop out as examples of the ease or difficulty of performance are in pitch and they're in timing. And unfortunately for us, because I'm studying medieval music, a lot of the assumptions underlying modern music feature analysis don't apply to medieval music. So we are dealing with a cappella choirs who don't have a fixed reference pitch, for whom the pitch might drift over the course of the performance, and this is not a bad thing stylistically, because they are trying to stay in tune with each other. And furthermore, the concept of a tempo, a time signature, and a beat hierarchy simply did not exist in the music of this time period. You cannot call the Gregorian chants to exist in 4/4 time. So a metric such as the normalized inter-onset interval is going to be entirely meaningless when applied to Gregorian music. So each piece, oh, it looks like I accidentally deleted part of a sentence there, but each piece also belongs to a slightly different genre. So what might work to measure the synchronicity in the plain chant might not be applicable to synchronicity in the Viderunt omnes, might not be applicable to the synchronicity of the motet. So I had to get a bit creative with the existing measures of synchronicity for describing the way the choirs are performing. The first approach is not so creative. This is a pretty standard approach. This is looking at the overall performance durations of each of the choirs and each of the pieces in each of their acoustics. And looking at the total performance duration, we found that choir A did not seem to be adjusting their performance duration significantly as a result of the acoustics, or even as an interaction term between the song and the acoustic. They're quite steady in their overall pace of performance. In comparison, choir B's performance durations were significantly impacted by changes to the acoustics as well as the song and the acoustic interaction term. So we can already see that these choirs are behaving very differently to the same experimental setup. The second measure that I looked at was onset synchrony, and this one was a little bit difficult to get to, so I'll walk you through the process. So first of all, taking the audio files, I did hand annotations of where I thought each note started. And then using those annotations, I ran them through a music information retrieval algorithm, using each of my annotations as a metadata marker to center a time window of 200 milliseconds around the area that I thought the note was in. The music information algorithm then provided a corrected form of where the onset was. So in this case, on this graph, my initial hand annotations are in red, and the corrections made by the algorithm are in blue. I'm very proud of one where I got 4 milliseconds away from where the computer said it was, but as you can see, I also was as far away as 40 milliseconds away from the algorithmically defined onset. So having created that, I now have a set of vectors for each performance. And these vectors are a note number and the time in which that note occurs. So in order to calculate the overall synchronicity, I used the method of dynamic time warping to compare the overall distance, the best fit distance between two pairs of performers at a time. And then I calculated descriptive statistics over the mean, the maximum, and the minimum DTW distance matrices to give a unitless estimate of how close each of the onsets were across the entire piece. So looking at it this way, so again, we have choir A on the right and choir B on the left. These are the estimated marginal means of the overall distance of their onsets. What we can see is that for both choirs, the distance of their onsets varied by choir and with the interaction term of choir and singer. But the acoustics basically had no effect on the overall distribution of onsets temporally. This is quite interesting because that would seem to suggest that there's a cultural aspect at play here, where both choirs have a different way of approaching the way they sync their note onsets that has almost nothing to do with the acoustics themselves. And the final way of looking at synchronicity was through motion analysis. So using facial recordings of each of the singers, I ran these through a head and eye pose estimator called OpenFace 2.0. which outputs a series of frame-by-frame estimates of the location, position, tilt, etc. of the face in the video. And after filtering these estimates to get rid of the very bad ones, the ones with low confidence ratings, I calculated the instantaneous quantity of motion from frame to frame. So this is the overall distance, or the overall amount of motion that is calculated in a frame, and it gives you an overall idea of the sorts of movement patterns, if not specific movements themselves, that the choirs are engaging in. So in the end, you end up with some graphs that look like this one on the top, which is a comparison of the instantaneous quantity of motions for two singers in one of the song acoustic pairings. I went through and on a per singer basis calculated the cross correlation of their quantities of motion, bootstrapped the resulting estimates to provide an estimate of the 95% confidence interval, and then chose the largest peak of cross correlation that exceeded that bootstrapped interval, and analyzed the location and the timing of that peak using a repeated measures ANOVA. So the results of this analysis show that choir A's correlated motion was significantly impacted by the acoustics and also by the interaction term of the acoustic and the song. However, choir B remains a lot more stable, and their correlated motion was only affected by the acoustic and not by the song. So what we can conclude from this preliminary research on the singing experiments is that the two choirs are adapting uniquely to this experimental setup. Choir A didn't adapt their overall performance speed to the acoustics, but they were adapting non-verbally to it. And choir B was adapting their performance speed to the acoustics and also their nonverbal communication. And finally, the note onset distribution did not seem to be affected at all by the acoustic, which might point again to internal ensemble culture and the way they rehearse. Now, the final part of my research was a set of listening experiments to see if people who are merely listening to the music also are reacting to the changing acoustics. A quick note before we jump into this. We know that people have individual taste preferences for room acoustics, and we also know that your own personal familiarity with musical genre can affect the way that you rate favorably or negatively performances of music from within that genre. So in order to get around this question of familiarity and expectation, two different listening tests were run, looking at the hypothesis that Vidor-and-Tomnes will be perceived as more suitable in the post-1182 acoustics than in the 1163. So like I said, I ran two listening studies here. The first one was a pilot study focusing on experts in medieval music, so people who are deeply familiar with these genres, either because they study them or because they perform them or they teach the performance of them. And then a second, more general study using a more generalist musician population as the test subject pool. These tests included both objective and subjective components, but for the sake of time, we're only going to look at the subjective results, and they were administered online using a Mushra-like interface. So the two questions they were asked, and again, we're only going to focus on one of them today. The main one they were asked was to rate the suitability of the acoustic for the song on a scale from 0 to 100. And the definition of suitability was drawn from the Room Acoustic Quality Index, which was presented in, I believe, 2018. And the definition I provided to my subjects was suitability is the oral qualification of the room for a given performance. High suitability means the room is not introducing distracting perceptual artifacts and is enhancing your enjoyment and experience of the music. So in the pilot test, 19 medieval music specialists took it. All of them had between at least 5 years of training in classical music, but most of them had more than 10 years of training. The participants were distributed across Europe and North America, and they were given the option to take the test in either French or in English. They listened to the same 3 songs, and in the pilot test, there were 7 acoustics. So the first 3 we've already covered quite a lot, but in addition to the historical acoustics, I provided a recreation of the modern-day 21st century acoustic, the acoustic of an entirely different liturgical space, the Grand Chapel in Avignon, and 2 conditions that would serve as sort of hidden anchors and hidden references. And just as an example of what the hidden anchor sounds like, here is what it is. As you can tell, it's not a very pleasant acoustic to listen to the music in, but if people were rating that acoustic as highly suitable, that would give us an idea that maybe they're not paying attention to the task very well. Maybe the rest of their responses should be discounted. Sorry about that. Okay. So the results of the suitability ratings from this pilot study are pretty interesting. So there is a significant effect of the acoustics on the suitability ratings. There's also an interaction term at play here. The suitability ratings weren't significantly impacted by the song that they were listening to, indicating that all 3 examples are close enough in genre that the raters are not necessarily identifying them as significantly different from each other. The 2 things to point out from this particular graph: 1163 statistically rated a little bit lower than 1182 and 1225. And second of all, you can see that there's an overall trend of the Viderunt omnes being rated much more conservatively than the other 2 pieces of music. The second test, like I said, was released to a general audience. So this was 110 musicians or musically inclined who were chosen for their background, experience, and interest in music. They came from 34 different countries, and this test was administered only in English. The same songs, pretty much the same acoustics, with the one difference being that because there were not statistical differences for the 2015 and the Grand Chapelle acoustics, those 2 were eliminated, and the 1500 acoustic was replaced in an attempt to see if a less reverberant condition would be rated any differently by the general audience. The results for this test of suitability show a significant effect of the acoustics on suitability, but also from song and also from their interaction term. This would maybe indicate a lack of familiarity on the part of the musicians or on a part of the participant pool who are reacting to each genre independently. But again, we see that the Viderunt omnes is still being rated very conservatively in comparison to the other 2 pieces of music. So if we compare the results from the specialist and the generalist tests, you can see that both groups tend to agree in rating Viderunt omnes more poorly than the other ones in terms of suitability. Both of them agree that 1182 is a more suitable acoustic than 1163, but they tend to disagree on whether or not 1182 is identical to certain other acoustics that were presented. Also, the generalists are reacting much more strongly to the type of song than the specialists are. And just to remind you here again, if we look at the plots from the specialists and the generalists, you can also see that the specialists are using a larger portion of the overall rating scale in comparison to the generalists, which, at least to me, indicates that they have more familiarity and greater comfort providing extreme opinions on these 3 songs than the relatively restrained responses coming from our general audience. To conclude about both of these listening tests, both groups show a small to moderate improvement from 1163 to the later acoustics. There seems to be a strong correlation between increasing suitability ratings and increasing clarity in the various churches that were used in the research. And the medievalists and the generalists had different approaches. So the medievalists had a mild correlation where increased suitability tracked with increasing reverberation time in the acoustics used, but the generalists have the inverse. So they have a moderately inverse correlation where as the reverberation time increases, the suitability decreases. And finally, both of them tend to be slightly skeptical about viderunt omnes, which I think would be a great follow-up study to figure out what's going on there. So let's talk about all of this research in context. What do all of these studies tell us about the potential relationship of the acoustics and the culture 800 years ago? So we saw from the objective modeling that the change from 1163 to 1182 was an immediate improvement in musical performance conditions as we would quantify them today in the modern era. We saw that both choirs were adapting independently to these changing acoustics. And we finally saw that the listening tests were reporting a moderate improvement of overall listening conditions as we go in time from 1163 to the later versions of the cathedral. Now, it's impossible to draw any conclusions from this. We don't have time machines. The people of the past remain in the past. We are culturally distinct from them. We have an entirely different set of priorities when it comes to what we listen to, why we listen to it, and what we consider to be important about it. So unfortunately, the answer of did the acoustics change the music, we'll never actually know that. But I think what we can say rather confidently as a result of these particular studies is that at least from the modern perspective, the change from 1163 to the Gothic architecture did create an acoustic environment that was more friendly towards the performance of complex musical styles. So the contributions of my work, I hope I'm not overstating the contributions, but I did do a longitudinal study of evolving acoustics at a site of cultural heritage, informed by both archival information and best acoustical practices. I adapted an existing calibration technique to a new rendering system for the experiments I conducted. I did conduct some rather comprehensive experimental sessions with specialist choirs in specialist acoustics, and I created subjective assessments to listen to the performances I recorded and understand how an audience might react to them. This work is not done. There's a lot to do before it's complete. For one, I need to expand the acoustic timeline that I've already done to include the 18th to 20th century. We'll talk about that later, Brian. I also need to expand the toolbox that I was using for the analysis of the choir performances. There is a depth to the performances and the data that I have right now that I have barely even begun to scratch the surface of, and who knows what else is in this data set. And finally, I'm working with a colleague on developing a better onset detection system to avoid the manual annotations that took up a fair amount of a year, and specifically that work with non-mensural, highly ornamented, non-standard tuning systems with instruments that don't have very clear attacks that will show up by the regular systems. So I know this was a bit long, but I want to thank all of you for your attention. I'm really looking forward to the conversation following this. And yes, this is the end of my presentation.